Okay, so some way the tribes adjusted to the changing situation throughout the 18th century. One was a major refugee movement to the Ohio country. So this was an extension of the middle ground, so to speak. Uh, so the Ohio country was at that time, up until Ohio became a state of the United States, it was that generally referred to a large part of the frontier area beyond the settled areas of North America. So, what today is Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Lower Canada, Wisconsin, all of what today we call the Upper Midwest, the swing part of the country. That part was kind of the swing part of the country, or swing part of North America in the 18th century too. It was a part of intense competition, and there was competition went several ways. So on the one hand, you had a lot of native refugees moving in there from different parts. So refugees of wars between like the Creeks and the Cherokee, for example, refugees from the Beaver Wars that have been ongoing, refugees who were seeking independence from the Iroquois League, who didn't want to accept their domination, refugees that were displaced from the eastern, more settled parts of the colonies, so the Delawares, for example. Many of them moved westward. Abenakis, people that lived in kind of the frontier of New England. A lot of the Mohicans who had lived in what's now Connecticut and New York, upper New York. A lot of different native peoples who didn't have some kind of a grounding connection with either the Iroquois League or the British or the French. They moved out to this territory and reconstituted into new groupings, such as the Ohio Iroquois, who became known of as the Mingo. And they're going to become important as we get to the 7 Years' War. These folks were eager to trade with the Europeans, but not be dominated with them. That's why they moved west. And France had been the one that they would rather trade with, although the French, by the 18th century, started treating natives a little bit worse than they had in the 17th. They started demanding higher prices or demanding, lower prices for the goods that the natives would provide, because the French had so far fewer colonists in North America. They were having trouble competing with England. And so some of the natives were upset about that, and there were some, I won't call them uprisings, but kind of small-scale quasi-wars that occurred between some native groupings and the French. In some cases, these were led by people who were born and bred of the middle ground, people who were themselves Métis, or what were half native and half French, thinking that they were being taken advantage of by the French colonists. A big thing that the French did that the English did not, and the French were starting to cut back a little bit because of the cost, was gift giving. It was considered important to give gifts in order to secure access to native trade. And so the French were trying to cut that back a little bit, and that was making the natives upset. The English wouldn't do it at all, though. So that was even worse. There were some natives who tried to play the French and English off of each other, and that usually would work pretty well when they wanted to distract both French and especially the English, the American colonists, from wanting land, instead focus them on fighting French or fighting Spanish if they were further south. That was something that a lot of these natives would do, and they were pretty skilled at it. And this lasted a good 50 years, where they were able to avoid being colonized by distracting the attention of the colonizers against other colonizers. And so there'd be some kind of dispute with the French or the English, and the natives in question, such as the Mingos, would go to the other side's agents and say, hey, we'll trade with you this. And then they'll go back to the previous side and say, hey, the English told us this. Are you going to put up with that? And the English would get all upset, and then they'd go fight the French, and there'd be a small-scale war. So there were a number of these, and they were connected to the imperial wars going on in Europe, such as the War of Austrian Succession and things like that in the 18th century. But the competition for control over the Ohio country started to become more of a problem for these natives as the English especially wanted to possess more of the land and less of the trade. Another problem that some natives encountered were internal fighting among themselves, which the colonists would take advantage of. So an example of that were the Creeks and the Cherokee. The Creeks had somewhat better relationships with Spain and France, but then as those began to decline, they looked more to England, and so the Creeks, remember, that's where Ponakisa came from. And what the Creeks did was start to try to ingratiate themselves more with the English, and what they would try to do is play the colonies off each other. So they were very happy about Georgia becoming a colony because that gave them another trading partner to kind of use as leverage against the Carolinas and also Spain and Florida. And that caused tension with the Cherokee, who were a little bit closer aligned with trading with the French and the British. The Cherokee had been pretty good at playing the French and the British against each other. The Creeks getting into that relationship made things awkward, and fighting among them ensued, and that caused a weakness among both of them that would play into their general problems going forward. As a result, they were all weakened. Also, a smallpox epidemic became a problem. Even when they had somewhat similar interests, reduced their ability to fight back against colonization. For the natives who were already pretty much colonized, the ones who lived in the eastern seaboard, they tried their best to survive colonization. So something that happened to the natives who remained on the eastern seaboard was that they became kind of ghettoized and tightly packed into their own communities and not really allowed to have enterprise with the rest of the colony. And that actually allowed them to maintain a lot of their cultural heritage, since they weren't dispersed and they would stay together. And so a colonist named Samuel Sewall from Massachusetts called this phenomenon Indianisme, which for him meant the process of native appropriation of European styles. For example, wearing clothes that were made out of European goods, European fabrics, but making them into something that looked like traditional native clothing, and using colors in their clothing that would symbolize their traditional life ways, adapting Christianity to fit a lot of their native spirituality. That was a way that some natives, despite being colonized by this point, were able to keep their traditional identity. For some, they used Christianity in their own way. Some of the early converts to what became known as the Great Awakening in the colonies, known as the New Lights, some native converts were actually interested in that and became preachers themselves. One of the most famous ones was a guy named Samson Occam, who was a Mohegan Christian clergyman and became one of the more famous Great Awakening pastors in the colonies in the mid-18th century. This image gives you a sense of how all the movements take place. So these refugee movements here, a lot of people moving to the Great Lakes area, Ohio country, a lot of different tribes, changes to the eastern tribes here, northeastern tribes also moving west, and you also had some movement of Canadian tribes in what became Canada moving around. And so there were various pressures that caused massive migration movements throughout this entire period. And those are going to become important in a minute. And obviously some, as we've talked about before, got sold into slavery. So a big part of the tension is going to be who would control the Ohio country. The French argued they controlled it, and the French based their claim of control over the Ohio country on their relationships with the natives. They said, we trade with these natives, and therefore we own this land, or we have stronger claim to this land. The English would just try to do business deals with natives, whether they were fraudulent or not, and then come up with this document and say, well, we own this land. And so a big point of contention was an area called the Forks of the Ohio River, which is what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And France and England both claim that territory, and that's going to become a problem.